Some of them, these are some of the projects I worked on. This waterfront projects in Harbourfront in Toronto, Branksome Hall in Toronto, Contemporary Calgary, Western North York Community Centre. These are some of the projects I worked on in Japan. It's a dental office, Young Shepherd shopping mall. So I've kind of done a lot. As an architect, you do work on building design to graphic presentations, to photography, to diagrams, illustrations, almost everything, even like energy visualizations. So whoever's in like a startup for energy or sustainability, carbon footprint, everything, we kind of, as an architect, we do a lot of it. So that's kind of my background. On the bottom left corner here, if you see my cursor, it's a Lush concept store in downtown Kyoto. And we did these little models. So that's kind of my background. Storytelling. So of course, I'm going to use one of Gensler's favorite books. Art Gensler is one of our founders, and he published this book called 50 Years of Hard-Learned Lessons in Building a World-Class Professional Services Firm. Even though I work there, it's actually like really helpful, and I would recommend anyone in a professional setting or trying to do a startup to purchase this book and read through it. And it gives you 50 lessons on how to kind of operate as a professional. And lesson 30 is my favorite. It's called storytelling. And when we present a project to a client, whether we're pitching a strategy, an interior design, exterior design, a branding exercise, because as a design firm, we do everything. A lot of it comes down to how powerful your story is. And the story isn't really just about like, kind of making stuff up. It has to come from a really real place, and you have to do research. You have to think about your client. And you have to remember that it's a conversation. So you really have to kind of like talk to the client, see where their goals are. Sometimes even the clients don't really know what they want. You have to kind of tell them, hey, here's the new trends, here are the new kind of commercial opportunities, here's the kind of right people for your team. And you kind of have to get to know them a lot. And sometimes our research, we have to give it back to them and say, hey, here's what everyone's saying about you, here's what you want, and they are not aligned. So part of it is kind of doing your due diligence. And two parts of this kind of coming up with a story is knowing how to share your story, whether it's like through LinkedIn posts, with Instagram, with different types of medium. Like if it's Instagram, then it's kind of like, do you do a series of photos? Do you do people engagement? If it's TikTok, do you do a video? So part of that visualization is understanding the appropriate work for the appropriate medium. And also like developing the great story is kind of part of that research too, right? Is it the kind of technical aspects that the clients really appreciate? Are they a technical startup? Are they a more kind of more about the soft skills, more about the kind of core values? So the kind of figuring out and identifying and kind of isolating what you want to be able to say is key to the storytelling piece. And it sounds a bit kind of high level, but it's actually really important, and we do take it to heart. So I'm just going to go through different kinds of topics. The first one, of course, I'm going to start with architectural drawings, just because that's my kind of bread and butter and I know it best. But this is an example where this is the Met condo tower that I did. It's townhouses and a plate plan. So this is a very technical drawing, and the intent of this kind of visual is to show how to actually construct the building, how to pour the concrete, the dimensions of each height. So it's very dry, but it's actually very technical, and it tells you everything you need to know for people to figure out how to actually pour the concrete, how to coordinate it, how much concrete, and then for everything to come together. So as architects, we kind of have to be able to choose how much to show, how little to show. This is, of course, a little bit more of like a sexier image. This is a rendering I did for East Gwillimbury Community Center. It's under construction right now. And when we're doing these renderings, we have to pitch it to the city, to the public, and get them to have a lot of buy-in, because we take these visuals to not just the public group on the government side, but we also take it for community engagement, for the average person living in this area. And besides doing the design, you have to kind of tell the story of this building, like what daytime it is, what is the landscape design, because we also have a landscape component. Who's going to be part of this conversation, and just showing how this space can be used. So even it's not just about how good the building looks, it's about the kind of the story you can tell with the image. And knowing, for example, this building here, that's a kind of axonometric sky bird's eye view. And we know that we have a courtyard, so we have to showcase, in this courtyard, there's a there's an art gallery, there's some mounds that we designed so it can become like kind of seating that kids can play with and jump on and walk on. There's going to be cars that you can use to access this space. There's going to be visuals, sight lines into this area, which has a swimming pool. And of course, like we had to show like a lot of images. This is what we call an axonometric. So program is kind of a bit of a fancy word we use, but it basically says like, oh, where's the kind of washroom? Where's the library here? Where's the pool? So this is like between a technical and a kind of design drawing. So, but it's really helpful for people to just quickly understand what your building is about. So whether you're presenting a building or you're presenting a startup concept, knowing how to create a strong graphic that tells a snapshot of your concept or whatever you're trying to pitch in a simple but colorful and kind of engaging diagram is very helpful. And this is the same kind of view, but we see parts of the top, so you can see how the natural light comes in. And this kind of graphic worked really well with the average kind of community goer, and they came to the community sessions. They understood quite quickly about how this building operates within the context of their neighborhood. And none of them were architects. They were just like anyone who wanted to come to the community engagement, they would be able to join. This right here is kind of like when you're trying to show a material sample. So say you're designing a product and you want to show materials you are. Here's what we kind of do to do a quick snapshot of what materials we're using for the building. So this is just a quick photo collage, but sometimes photos are very, very powerful because you can show, like, rather than using a 2D graphic you find on Google, you can just use a photorealistic image of the actual product we're using so people understand better like something they can relate to, because not everyone is a designer, so not everyone can relate to a physical reality without knowing what it is, if that makes sense. This is what we did for a section. We call this a sectional kind of perspective. So it's a cut through the same building, but it shows quickly like, oh, where are the reception areas? Where's the gymnasium? Where's the fitness areas? And how those apertures are designed to create a story about the building. How each aperture actually creates and defines the type of activity that's part of this wall. Because here's a track, here's the gym, here's a reception, here's a washroom, here's the view to the pool, and here's a view to the pool as well. But it's part of a kind of gathering area for the parents to come see, because there's a bit of a kids pool here, and there's also a view to the library. So again, kind of doing a quick summary of a diagram communicates a lot, and some people would be able to pick up, hey, you have skylights here, so natural light would actually come into these rooms. And this, even though it seems simple, it took us a lot of time. I stay up to like 3 in the morning all the time to just like make this diagram happen. So it's sometimes it's worth it, because this is what people use to understand quickly what the project was about. This is another simple diagram showing materials, and we do these floor plans and you can add materials to them. So this is like what I would say it's between abstract and real. Like it's abstract enough that's kind of cartoonish, but you add enough textures that people know, oh, this is going to be concrete throughout the whole thing. It's going to be polished concrete, and people can navigate themselves. You give them enough material and enough information. These are some views here that I developed, and it's the same building, but these are just abstract perspectives and renderings. And this is the interesting piece, is that when you're telling a story, sometimes you don't have to tell them the full story, in the sense that like when we do architectural renderings, sometimes it's like we show realistic people, everyone looks realistic, everyone, you show a lot of detail and everything's fully colored, but that might be too much information. This stage was kind of mid-design stage. So rather than trying to finish everything and dropping on the client's face, like what I thought was better was to show kind of like a bit abstract, show a bit of like enough detail to show where our design thinking and intent is. Yeah, I see a comment, love the minimalism and abstract people. Like, thank you. It actually took a lot of time, because I had to create these origami people, create these like furniture settings and render it. And how it communicates is that it communicates the light, it communicates that this is going to be out of wood, it communicates that this is going to be a different type of wood, this is going to be a slat, these are going to be white kind of slats, these are going to be gray walls, the water is going to be here, it's going to be polished concrete. So it shows the essence of your intent, but it doesn't drop everything, and it allows the client to kind of finish the image in their mind. It's not so photorealistic they feel like, oh, this is already final, you guys already designed it without us. That's not how a good working relationship works. You always want to try and present something and hear feedback and try to get to the same goal altogether. So these are some similar views. I'm not going to pause too long on each of them, but it starts forming a story about how the whatever you're talking about comes together. And here's like the central area, the same community gallery. Showing it in sunlight was very key because our design was facing south, and that was for a specific reason. We had a clear story that we designed to allow natural light to come in. It's for these kind of moments. So choosing the moment of your story to tell that story is actually quite important. This is in East Gwillimbury, so I chose Man Ray. He's a photographer and artist that I actually really liked, and it happens that he had roots based in East Gwillimbury, so it was perfect for telling the story because everyone recognized the artist, and it's, oh, you really did research about our community, and it's heartfelt, which is true because I remember thinking about it very deeply and understanding how to tell the story of this community. We have a question, which software for section and view? The software here was used in Enscape, and this was a combination of Revit, SketchUp, and Rhino. So and Photoshop and Illustrator. So 5 or 6 programs. And similar views. I'm not going to spend too much time. The library showing an image in process is actually very powerful. So here is that kind of same view from the pool, but towards the library. And here, like I was working on the library design of the door. So it's actually a huge sliding door for accessibility needs, but actually showing it in motion like this, so closed and then open, can be simple, but it tells you that, oh, actually the layering of views is what I was trying to communicate. And people understood very quickly how the library would function when it's open versus closed and how after hours it would work. This is another community center I worked on, and we won a Canadian Architect Award of Excellence for it. It's going to be Canada's first net zero energy aquatic facility. It's going to be in Toronto. It was a really hard project, but something like this, again, like an axonometric where you show the floor, you show the site, you show everything in one view, and it's kind of graphically rich enough that people can understand the story, and you show a section altogether. This is, and of course you lay it out, but not too many graphics, and everything's kind of aligned so it tells a story. This is like a basic understanding of how layout is done. Some more renderings. These ones I'm not going to go into too much, just because I want to get into like more graphic design. So the next section is about kind of layout and how to do graphic design. So my training is as an architect, but there's actually graphic designers who work full-time as well. And I think I admire graphic designers a lot because they're able to produce things out of thin air sometimes. They come with a story. I sit behind someone who does graphic design for us full-time. And she's super good. She just comes up with all these like designs that tells a story out of thin air, whereas architects were trained more for working with constraints. But of course, we kind of have to dabble into graphic design as well, just because that's how we engage most of our material. So one resource that I would recommend everyone to take a look at, it's free. I'll take this name down. It's the Vignelli Canon. And it's an Italian designer from mid-century, I believe. And it's like it was free, it's online, and it tells you kind of a snapshot of what graphic design is capable of doing and what to look out for. So the first thing is, for example, if you're on InDesign, Google Slides, whatever, grids, margins, columns, and modules are like the bread and butter of almost every graphic designer. Grids, you kind of lay them out to understand how to use it or disuse it, like how to compose along a grid. Sometimes you want to align it. So for example, this piece of text here, you want to align it perfectly to a grid, but you want to only use 2/3 of a page. And then the rest of the space, you give a lot of white space or blank space, then you give people room to breathe. So if this is printed as a book, then it's kind of more attractive to read. You bold only the titles, so that gives people a quick understanding. Okay, you want to talk about grids, margins, columns, and modules, and the rest is about communicating how it's used. And types of grids is also important. We use this for architectural drawings too, whether we're splitting it by 2x4, 5x4, 6x6 grid, the type of page layout you use, you should kind of take that into consideration. And if you're doing a startup and pitching something, then thank you, Laura. Are you a graphic designer? It's true. I respect them a lot for what they are able to like quickly produce, and the concepts they come with sometimes just it's really beautiful. But yeah, like I would say graphic designers deserve a lot of kudos too, because like all this kind of thinking, how to use a grid, not use a grid, it's all kind of invisible. Whoever sees it right away, they kind of see it right away, but they don't understand all the thinking that went behind it. Font types, we're still in the Vignali canon. So in architecture school, the first day they hammer into our faces and brains that font is so important. So this is kind of deep in my uh, mental lessons as well. Choosing the right font, choosing the right story to tell with your font is really important, and making sure it's consistent. So usually you try to choose only one font for like a clear direction, but of course, like if there's a good reason that you want to switch fonts and tell a story that's kind of parts of a whole, then of course you should consider that carefully. But it should always be with intent, and it shouldn't be cavalierly switching. So usually for example, architecture portfolio, if it's like I'm presenting it out of my work, then I would try to keep it all one font for consistency. But if I'm trying to say, oh, this one I worked on this brand, and then tomorrow I worked on a different brand, then I guess my work would communicate alongside the sense of that brand's font. Someone commented, what, no Comic Sans or Papyrus? I'm not a judge of anything. Usually, the rule of thumb for architects, we hate serifs. I personally don't really care, but we were always told, don't use serif, don't use serif. Sometimes I defy it and I get away with it, but sometimes I get crucified for using serif. So uh, you should research who you're presenting to, then it's a bit better. Our favorites usually are like Futura and Helvetica New, and those are kind of very simple block fonts that we enjoy. Uh, the manual also covers brochures on how to use of color. I think sometimes a stark use of color like this is quite powerful, right? Just red, pink, and then black. And there's different schools of thought on how to approach use of color. Some may say pink is different from red, is different color, but on another kind of scenario, red and pink are in a way a similar tone. It's a shade of one tone. So by using one simple red tone, actually your graphic can communicate something very strong. And black and white are kind of course, sometimes they're colors too, but they're also neutrals. I usually like thinking of them as backgrounds to everything, and then just using one color like this. And you can do a watercolor of a landscape, a watercolor of a building, or a brochure about dancing. Then it's quite attractive, and you make a big font like this, and you kind of people remember it, and you kind of want to read it. Different kind of graphic designers and conceptual artists. I think focusing and finding people that you really enjoy and find inspiration in is really helpful. So one of my favorite fashion designers, Issey Miyake, of course, he passed away last year. I was very sad. I own some of his clothing. He's a Japanese fashion designer that does these pleats of clothing, and his whole concept is called Pleats Please. And there's one of my favorite Japanese graphic designers is Taku Sato, and he did a series of advertisements for Issey Miyake's Please Please. And he did all these kind of fun advertisements where he took pleats and made it into different everyday animals or objects. So here it's a penguin, and he kind of did it out of the pleats cloth. But it's a penguin. So it's a bit cheeky, it's a bit funny, it's a bit like at first you don't really know what it is, and you kind of are engaged. So kind of having that invitation to a story is quite seductive sometimes, I would say. He also did these ones out of like sushi or like hammers, and it's really quite fun. And of course, he uses their classic Please Please font with the names. So that's kind of how you can get away with clashing different kind of iconographies and fonts, but also leaving a lot of empty space or blank space around to let the graphic breathe. So simplistic, it's simple, but it has intention and people can focus very well. I would say is a really great approach. Nendo is also one of my favorite designers. Actually, has anyone, I can't see a show of hands, but if you happen to know Nendo, you can type in the chat, I know him. But Oki Sato is his name, and Nendo is his firm. They're based in Tokyo, but Actually, Okisato, he was born in Toronto, so he's technically Canadian Japanese. I think he went to University of Toronto, but he's usually invited for Milan Design Week for doing from everything from like a lamp design to a cup design to doing a pavilion for Japanese expos to almost everything. And Muji, he did a bunch of designs for Muji. Of course, they don't brand their stuff with creative names, but I think the birdhouse clocks were designed by him and a series of other things. But the he was also mentored by Miyake, so there you can see a bit of that lineage in thinking. But he always does these kind of very whimsical starts to a project. So here is a series of lamps, but here's one example where he kind of usually starts with these kind of really smart kind of cartoons that tell a very simple story, and there are always these line kind of graphics that are like not visually disturbing, but visually very intentful and clean, and kind of tells you, oh, Olympics opening, Olympics closing, Paralympics opening, and then Paralympics closing. So it's about the flower opening and closing and growing. So there's a story to how the timeline of a design changes, and we don't really know what the design is about. All he's telling you is about there's an activity, a rest, and a non-activity that's associated with the timeline of how whatever he's designing is operating. But of course, if you read the letters, it's Olympics. It has to do with something with Olympics. And of course, he was invited to design the kind of final Olympic torch, where the torch, they get passed along different people, and then they light the torch. And I think it was Naomi Osaka, the American Japanese tennis player, who lit the final torch sequence. You can find it on YouTube. But the continuity of how that works was that this flower, when the Olympics opens, it starts blooming. So it closes, and it was actually a mechanical machine. It closes, opens, and then finally opens, and uses hydrogen gas, I think, hydrogen to power the flame, because it's supposed to be sustainable resource. And whether you like the design or not, what I'm trying to make the point is that you can tell a story through a simple cartoon, whether you think it's a cartoon or image or whatever you want to do, and take that simple concept and distill it into something even like an Olympic torch. And I would say, to the bigger point I'm trying to make here, is that like find the designers that speak to you, or the people who present enough storytelling that you find it cool. It doesn't have to be a designer. It can be anyone that you think is a great speaker or a great kind of person that can inspires you. So we kind of touched a little bit about fonts already, but it's kind of nice to talk about it again. So I love horror movies, I love horror TV shows, and this one always kind of struck me because so I used to love watching American Horror Story, and if anyone watches it too, feel free to comment. But I found it quite kind of fun and clever because it uses the Macintosh font, who's also was well known in the architecture field for doing the schools of architecture in Glasgow that I visited. It was very, very beautiful and kind of this turn of century type of font. But they also adapted it to use an American Horror Story. And whoever's watched that show, it's basically about kind of each season is about a hotel, asylum, a cult, and a coven. So they take that font and make it into a very scary font, and they always make it very big on a TV. And each season they adapt a bit of that font and they add a little bit of a spin. So there's both storytelling and continuity and consistency. So storytelling with visuals, in my opinion, is always about consistency. You can't tell a story that is like, sometimes it's about one thing and you switch topic right away. There has to be a continuity so people remember, and that is the basis of a story. But what I'm also trying to say is that you can feel free to look at different historic fonts and try to adapt it to make it into your own font, or try to take two things that are kind of almost disparate and combine them, and there's a contrast, and that contrast sometimes is very powerful, or memorable. So I would suggest you to take a look at that. And here's, if you think about the color scheme, it's kind of similar too, right? There's white and black, and the only other strong color is basically red. You see a bit of yellow, but it's basically red in each poster. So I think, again, the visual consistency of using only one strong color is quite adaptable, whether it's poster design or to TV advertisement, to again, like brochure or watercolor or anything. Something I want to show here was one of my favorite Pixar movies. What's that? Joy? I forget. Emotions? Or no, I forget the it's the Pixar one about emotions. But what I thought was really cool is that I somehow saw the Japanese posters that advertised for the Inside Out. Yes, thank you, Haley. Inside Out. So of course I watched the English version, but I saw the Japanese version too. And they're so in East Asia, calligraphy is typically used in brushwork, and brushwork is very communicative of emotion. So of course they hired a very famous Japanese calligrapher, Sishu. I would recommend everyone to look at her stuff. She's really, really good. She exhibits in Paris and I think Germany as well, and she does a lot of collaborations and mixing styles. But they hired her to help create the calligraphy for the poster designs. And you can see how like the brushwork, even if you can't read kanji, you can kind of feel the emotion, right? Like big brushstrokes are written with a lot of anger because this is rage. And you can almost feel the emotion of the brushstrokes, and they're big, they're thick, they kind of end abruptly, and they're a bit rough. And the character itself is quite large. Happy, of course, you can almost see it smiling. That's actually part of the physiognomy of East Asian characters. Yeah, exactly. This is actually a mouth. It's not actually just the recognition. There's actually a mouth to it. That's part of the character, because this character combined means happy. But it's almost like it's dancing, so it's quite playful. It's a nice yellow color, and you can kind of feel uplifted just by looking at this calligraphy, which is why a lot of East Asian households, they have calligraphy, and we call it calligraphy paintings, because the calligraphy itself shows and comments a type of message and an emotion. Sadness here, you can almost see it like it's like, oh, it's like kind of almost like a face. This character actually means heart, but together it's like a sad character. It's almost withering away. You almost feel like the energy of the person drawing the character is like quite weak, and they're depressed. So like you don't have to even know the character, maybe you can feel it in the brushstrokes. This one is fear. It's almost similar to sadness, but there's a fear to it where it's like, oh, this person's like kind of shaky, a little bit thin, and the brushstrokes here are kind of like little dots, because you're kind of, oh, I'm not even so sure how big I can draw. And this one here, thank you. Yeah, that's exactly the Sishu. And this one is jealousy. So you can kind of feel there's some sharpness to it, kind of like almost like the body is like squaring up, and there's a bit of disgust to it. Disgust or jealousy, I forget, but it's kind of similar. There's a sharpness of emotion and kind of not fully facing you, that kind of character, and there's a bit of a negative emotion. But I always thought this was such a great way, because it's like showing core emotions with one simple word, and shows how brushstrokes can communicate emotion, whether it's one culture or another. It doesn't really matter. You can probably do this in English too, but the simplicity of just one character showing that is kind of my point. And the point I'm trying to make is that it shows the use of font and how it can communicate a brand, a story, and even the shade of color is subtle. You see, go from like very, very light yellow to a dark orange, is able to show another kind of subtlety to the character that makes it almost like a part of a character that you can feel. So that's basically this slide. Diagrams, I would say, are something that maybe a lot of startups would use. So for example, here it's a diagram from Bjork Ingels Architects, and they always do these kind of semi-cartoonish diagrams to express a building design. And the strategy of this is that it shows something complex in a very simplistic and kind of engaging manner. And what they're trying to do here is that, oh, you're trying to show the sun goes on top, there's full sunlight, and there's sunset. And here's the facade, and it shows you, oh, during rain, it's going to come rain on it, but the way that the facade is designed, it kind of makes the water go away. And during the west facade, where it's a very high heat, then they have smaller apertures, so less light can come in. For the east facade, it's also smaller apertures, so less light can come in. South is also like the larger ones are here to show the entrances, so that's where it's like nice light, but you also can't have too much because it also gets pretty hot during the summer. But it kind of does several things. It tells you the large context of your story. In this case, is a city. In another case, it can be your target audience, and it tells you like this is your main concept. So they always do like a strong, hard line around your building, even though it's not realistic, but it makes you look at this building right away. Everything else is lighter, and then the context, even though it takes up most of the space, it's very, very light. And then you have these kind of floating diagrams, and again, the restraint on use of color, so just one color, the sun. So it tells you this whole diagram is about how the building interacts with light. This one I wanted to show because it's kind of like a quick diagram, but one thing in architectural renderings I noticed was that there was just not enough like seniors to BIPOC people to kids to seniors in wheelchairs. So I had to create or to LGBTQ families. So I made a presentation to the firm I was at and told them, hey, we need to like purchase some more models or spend some resources creating this library. So after I got everyone's buy-in, I made a little quick diagram to show, hey, here's all the cool new digital models that we can use for our renderings. And I made a little graphic just to show like how much more engaging it is when you have people that tell a story, like a wheelchair person that is actually happy and enjoys their time, or a person with a walker and they seem happy, or someone swimming, or a more like senior person playing basketball, or a kid, or LGBTQ family. Like people want to see themselves reflected into whatever you're telling them, right? So if you're pitching to a community center, for example, that has a lot of LGBTQ community members, which we did, then having those people in your package and your visuals is very powerful. Or having seniors is very important because a lot of the times when we're designing for community centers, the seniors are coming to these community engagements, and having them reflected in your material is great. Look, there's a senior running. There's someone that is on a rollerblade, and it's kind of you can kind of be cheeky about it too, depending on who we are presenting to. But just having that full capability of telling that story, it's the people, it's in the details. And there's sometimes where we even did building designs that we weren't like so ready yet, but just because the people told such a great story, the community engagement went super well. They loved it because of just what the story was what the story told. This here is a diagram as well. We were designing this kind of washroom block, but it's subtle and there's a bit of a diagram. So for our presentation, again, if you're doing a startup and selling a product or pitching an idea, that idea can be shown four ways. So here it's like the same block. Here it's just like the white continues upwards, or the blue is across the top, or we take away these locker rooms, or with this taken out with TV screen, with the screen and a kind of a bin instead, and how that works with the border crossing at the top. It's subtle, but by doing this, you create a diagram that shows them four options. And if they care, like this one, the client here really cared about how this block looked. But by doing this, you tell them quickly like what the visuals are right away, and you can put it into one page and tell them, walk them through the four options and spend a little bit of time there. And by the end of it, you can have a decision. But sometimes it's worth it just to show them what they want and then show them what you want, so you kind of reach the same conclusion. So this is kind of a comparison strategy. This is another energy diagram. This one was also Bjarke Engel's. We usually do these kind of diagrams where you show a building, and again, if you're doing sustainability or anything energy related, a diagram like this that has icons that shows trees or how your energy works throughout whatever you're trying to sell is very helpful, right? Do we show like the kind of wind that comes through and how the heat rises, how the green roof works with the exterior, how the sunshade works to block like southern light, how the air quality works with the exterior facade. So a useful diagram that's a bit cartoonish for something like this is always super helpful to visualize something that otherwise would be very dry and boring. This is another type of drawing that we use to communicate a lighting design. So it's kind of, I know this is a little bit more architectural, but the point is that actually these are more lighting architects, so it's a different profession. But the point is that you can take one medium, so a drawing in this case, and use it to express a lot of different kinds of things. There's a type of, I think, flexibility in thinking that one needs to have when you're doing trying to figure out how to tell your story. Because if you use I don't know, like a PowerPoint. The PowerPoint doesn't have to be a PowerPoint full of just text or messages. That's how conventionally everyone uses it, but you can use PowerPoint for anything, right? You can just try to think outside the box and figure out how best to use that tool you have to tell the story. So in this case, the drawing tells you where it's a ceiling fan or the ceiling light outlet or kind of different types of light and different quantities of light. And we do these drawings too. We call them actually like reflected ceiling plans. And again, it's the same thing, but here we use Photoshop to color a floor plan to show how light distributes into a room. And this is more of a drawing for marketing or for a different kind of lighting study, but it's simpler than the one before, right? You don't have to read any legend or describe anything. You're able to just like take this and understand quickly, okay, this is the light, it's a radial light. This light lights around the table, it's in the ceiling, and it shows you quickly. So even with Photoshop and just a simple brush, you can tell a story very quickly. Illustrations. This one I do Japanese archery at the Japanese Canadian Cultural Center. So we had one year where we wanted to design the club's t-shirt. So of course, like they got me to work on that design, and basically what I did is I took a 3rd century kind of Japanese archery kind of scripture from 2,000 years ago and integrated as part of this kind of abstract arrow design, and we made it into a club t-shirt. And it was funny because it went really well. Everyone liked it. We brought it to Minnesota for our kind of competition, and it got sold out because people thought that it spoke to them, and it wasn't just exclusive to the Toronto or Canadian region. It was trying to get at something more universal. And maybe talking about this, I can think about how I think the strongest stories are always universal, because you hit something that everyone can relate to. It doesn't necessarily have to be about one. It's not about exclusivity. It's always about being welcoming and being able to make connections and find something good in humanity, and how everyone can connect to is always aspirational, and people would enjoy taking part in it. Also, don't be afraid to take inspiration from different historic sources. This is a painting from around 1500 years ago, where they originally practiced Japanese archery in Kyoto as well. But the point is that like lessons throughout history are always irreverent, or they stand through the test of time. The best ideas, in my opinion, always stand through the test of time. So if you're attracted to 1300s medieval illustrations or anything, feel free to go and find that source. You don't have to always use whatever you see on TV. Just to, I would say, do some research, do a bit of soul searching, and find your inspiration. This, for example, is from Index Serafianus. I think it's done in the 1800s as an homage to a 1500s Renaissance manuscript. And this style is much more playful, of course. They create their own font, they create their own little illustrations, but it's super whimsical, but tells a story. And the same lesson I would share is to find inspiration in any kind of source you like. We have Google, we have AI, there's Midjourney, there's DALL-E, there's all these different things. So I would really encourage you to, enjoy and use Instagram, whatever you want, to find things that really speak to you, that makes you want to tell a story. Infographics are something that probably everyone needs to use. Feel free to type in the chat if this is especially interesting for you. But here's an example from the Gensler Research Institute, which I'm also taking part in. And here's a previous research from a different team, but it's all public. You can Google it. It's on our website. But here was about healthcare wayfinding. And this is a study that we released a couple years ago that talks about how to design for wayfinding in a hospital. And my father was in a hospital for almost 10 years with cancer. So I took care of him, and I remember how terrible hospital environments are. And there's no reason why we can't design hospitals that are both more pragmatic and functional to more engaging and healthy. But this study is to the point of visual storytelling, is to say that this study tries to identify how to simplify the patient experience in healthcare environments. And this is the kind of cover page, and it shows that, oh, hey, it's a bit of a kind of like a, was it Wayne's World, or what was that earthworm that had that kind of embedded into a city as a cartoon for kids? I forget. But it's a little bit cartoonish, but it kind of tells you, oh, hey, a hospital, we're talking about a hospital, but it's also a bit of a maze, and everyone wants to get to each other, but everything's a bit confused. So that tells a story that we're trying to say that healthcare wayfinding is not something that's super simple, and it's not something that's super resolved yet, but it's a simple graphic, and it tells you, use a little bit of texture to show the kind of roadmap to let it stand out. But again, it's like a specific use of color palette, these kind of pastel colors, there's consistency. I'll skip this one for now, and here is kind of like a cartoonish section of a hospital. I'm trying to tell you, hey, wayfinding is an important yet often underperforming aspect of many healthcare environments, potentially hindering the patient, visitor, and staff experience. That's the key takeaway. And we start explaining what we do. We highlight the kind of portion. We conducted a comprehensive audit of a third-party research related to, etc. I'm not going to read it, but here's a way to kind of tell your quick finding, your thesis, what your methodology was, what is the context, what is the big title, and use different sizes of fonts to tell that story. And then there's visual consistency from the previous slide to this. Then you tell them the final results. So, hey, wayfinding is a key aspect of the healthcare environment, etc. And then you kind of tell them, right? And you can use graphics to kind of split the page or guide the eyes. And we have our kind of graphic teams that summarizes our research. You can put some quotes. So it's always pretty cool how, again, using a visual to storytell is already kind of getting people understanding enough that their mind is ready to absorb the information you're telling them in kind of bite-sized pieces. And from the beginning, from the thesis, the context to the solution, and then next steps. So that's kind of a infographic / study. And I don't want to make sure I have enough time, but I think 3D models are also very important if you're working for a startup that is prototyping or you're, say you're designing a pencil or designing an app or whatever, right? Like having a physical model to show to someone is always very, very engaging. When we do a building model, when we bring it to a client meeting, that is always super, super engaging, even though the model is a 3D print model or anything. People like touching things. Tactility is very good. So if you're trying to storytell, it doesn't have to be just a presentation. It can be a mock-up or a maquette, whatever you want to call it. So I want to show this model here. Is by a Swiss architect, Le Corbusier, in the 1950s. Swiss French, and he did a series of chapels. You can actually go visit it. I would recommend you to go see it, La Tourette. And no, sorry, this one's not La Tourette. This is, I mistake in the name. This is Ronchamp. It's in the east of France, and it's a chapel. And he did all these really beautiful models where the roof is sloped, and this is like an abstract model. The real built form is not actually like this. It's devoid of materials here, but what he's trying to do is to show shadow, light, how it's contextualized into the orientation of the sun and how people can engage it. And you can imagine this is a scale model. I saw this in Paris because they did an exhibition of his work in the Centre Pompidou. But what I'm trying to say is that the details and showing your whole concept into something physical is something very engaging. So I'm not telling you that you have to build an entire model like this, but you can 3D print, you can do a lot of things. It's not that hard. You can probably Google that and figure out how to do it. That's quite common now. This one I 3D printed and designed. It's a 3D print steel ring. I should have brought it so I can show it on camera, but the photography of your work is something very powerful too. So taking photos of what you're trying to show sometimes is nice to accentuate certain details. And of course, because I use steel, then I use a kind of a slate rock as a background to kind of accentuate the materiality, the material choice, and how this is designed, and how I kind of create this ruptured texture, and it speaks to it. So again, it's about the consistency of your story. My story here is that I created a ring and it's very rugged kind of style. It's about like a steel and rock and igneous rock formations. So the rest of your photograph, whether it's the background, everything has to always say the same story. So then it's consistent. And of course, I use the macro lens to show the kind of enough detail. The rest you can blur out or whatever, because part of storytelling is editing your story. So you don't have to tell them 100% of exactly what you want to do. Sometimes it's telling the most important 20%, most important 40%, and then the rest can be in shadow and can be in blur, and they can ask questions about it, they can be engaged about it, but having focus is very important, and the right lighting. I use sunlight here. Same thing, I 3D printed and designed this out of steel. It's a wristband, and again, I use this kind of rock background because it's a similar approach, but this one I use more light, natural light, and showed the kind of shadow line this way. There's a money clip I did. This one was plastic, but it was kind of fun. And showing it in use is always very good because people can imagine, but sometimes you want to guide their brain and how to perceive whatever you're presenting to them. And this one shows that it's one entire continuous strip, and how many banknotes it can carry. So it's a fun little exercise. This is like a kind of a powder holder I made for the archery club, the Japanese archery club, and it holds like rice husk powder for the grip of your glove, and it just shows the contraption in time. So how it opens, how I fill this with powder, how it closes, and then how this is a bit blurred, but how you can close it with a locking system. So it's a prototype, but showing your model in steps is always very engaging, I would say, and then bring the model for the meeting so people can touch it and play with it. They get it right away. I would say also travel, like if you, whether it's through the country, whether it's through road trips, everything is always, you can find inspiration in everything. This one I want to show because I happened to work on a project with an Italian team recently, and I had to present to them, and I didn't know like how to channel it because at first I was presenting stuff that was more local, and then they didn't really respond well. So okay, if you're all from Italy, then maybe I'm gonna start channeling some Italian stuff. And I dug out all my travels from Venice from school because we had to go ski the School of Architecture in Venice. And then I told a whole story about the School of Architecture, Carlo Scarpa. This is the School of Architecture, and that's Carlo Scarpa. He sculpted all these kind of walls out of stone and created this quote from 1700s. I told the story, and then the clients really liked it, and they responded to it because they could relate very well to what I was trying to get to with the design. This is Montreal, it's Bastance, it's a ballet school, and what I was trying to say with this one is that when you're taking photographs to show to people your visual, you can also focus on what you're trying to say. So here is like the brick is actually vertically oriented. These are precast brick systems that tell, it's actually quite cool, the design, because typically bricks are horizontally laid, right? But the fact that they vertically created this wall and created all these shadows, I took a photo of it to capture that kind of material and how the title, the organization's kind of brand is kind of indented. So the point of this is that when you're traveling, you can also take photographs of everything, whether it's a menu at a restaurant. I'm the weird one. When I go to restaurants, I always take photos of all the food menus because I was, oh, this is interesting. I want to know how they design their menus. So keep a folder of things that inspire you. I know there's Pinterest, I know there's all these different things, but nothing beats using your own body, your own mind, and your own eyes to see it. And of course, having Instagram, Pinterest is always good for extra inspiration, but when you see it, you think about it when you're showering, when you go for a workout, driving, whatever, the ideas kind of start coming to your head to tell a kind of very unique story. There's also Carlo Scarpa. There's the wall I was trying to think about. And then read a lot too, like Carlo Scarpa used this kind of graphic design to create his matrix of stone to create this beautiful kind of pattern. And also even in our own city. So this is the original Japanese Canadian Cultural Center that Raymond Moriyama designed. And this is a page of the Canadian Architect magazine. It's our national architecture magazine, but you can go travel. It's still there right now. I think it's different. I think it's the Indian Cultural Center right now. I forget. They changed buildings. This is the current Japanese Canadian Cultural Center. Sorry, it's a little bit blurry. but I would say travel everywhere you want to go to find inspiration. And then lastly, before we end here, I want to show a presentation. I want to show a client one, but I was like, okay, maybe this is better if I just show something more on the personal side. So this is all my own work. This one I submitted for a competition, for a healthcare competition, and is inspired by my father. This is me and my father when we were in Vancouver. So the theme was about healthcare. So I chose to kind of develop a graphic package and design, and you can only submit your graphics, so you can't be there to present anything. So the graphics was very important to storytell about what you're trying to do. So I tried to use like, simple color, just a pink color, but the concept was about palliative care rooms because my dad died of cancer and I took care of him for a long time into palliative care. So I try to channel something I knew very well and try to be realistic and, using, even if like talking about why am I interested, making that font in your paragraph taking up the entire page, that's okay because you're going to tell the story. A little bit of a story about like how I grew up with him, etc. I'm not going to go into too deep, but kind of telling the story of your presentation and why you're interested, why you're doing this is always very engaging. And of course, I show a bit of that research here. I had to cramp it a bit. Usually I would recommend you to kind of give more free space, but for this competition, there was only a limited amount of pages you can show. But I was trying to show how palliative care is a very underserved practice area, and especially in Canada, and most of the doctors don't necessarily have training in it. So this is my background research. It's all based on real hard data, federal framework data, and something that is needed. So trying to get to that story point about why I was doing it, why it's needed, because it's not just about me, it's about like the world actually needs this. It solves a problem. And then the quick design. And here I'm not trying to solve for people who have a lot of money for like super custom private palliative care. I was just thinking about the average low to middle income family, which was basically my family. We were in a public hospital, so the room was just terribly designed. So I'm just trying to do like very simple stuff. Can we have a kitchenette so we can cook for people? You know what I mean? I'm not gonna get into the whole design of it, but again, it's about consistency of color, showing one axonometric, one simple diagram, and then trying to tell the story in small little details. Different orientations, a floor plan, how people can come in, use the space, how the wall works, the kind of different pieces to how the palliative care room works, different types of seating, the overnight bed, small details to large concepts, elevation views on how these kind of work. So if you're selling a product, this kind of drawing or diagram might be very helpful. How the ceiling works with integrated downlights, speakers, etc. And that's basically it. Maybe we have a couple minutes for questions.